Welcome to week 1 of the crochet along. It's great that you're joining in. Today we're crocheting the gauge swatch and at the same time learning the stitch for making this cardigan. This is part 1 of the ClothingCAL and we start by crocheting a gauge swatch. Not only does the swatch help you learn to crochet the main stitch we'll be using, but also how big your stitches should be. If you crochet more loosely or tightly than I do, then you'll need to use a different size crochet hook. For the whole cardigan, I'm using a 6mm hook and a 5mm hook. We crochet the gauge swatch using the 6mm hook only. The whole cardigan is crocheted using 2 strands of yarn held together. That's 1 strand of Yarn and Colours Glamour and 1 strand of Yarn and Colours Baby Fabulous, always held together. If you're struggling to keep an even tension when pulling the yarn from 2 separate balls, wind the 2 strands together into a single ball that you can work from. That will help you keep the same tension in both. Let's get started on our swatch. You begin of course with a slip knot, and we're using the size 6mm crochet hook. Place the slip knot on your hook and then chain a number of stitches. The cardigan is crocheted in a V-stitch and there are lots of different ways of working a V-stitch, so with or without chain stitches between them, with 2 double crochets next to each other, or with 4 double crochets next to each other. In this pattern we work without chain stitches in between and with 2 double crochets to create the V's. The main reason for making a swatch is to check your crochet tension. It's important to know whether you crochet loosely or tightly, as that will impact the final size of your garment. There's no point putting in all that effort into making an item of clothing that turns out to be too big or too small, so always check your gauge. To measure the gauge, we need an area that's 10 by 10 centimeters, but don't crochet a square that's just 10 by 10. Sometimes the stitches along the edges pull together or stretch out a little, which can be misleading. So make sure your square is a bit larger than 10 by 10 to give yourself a reliable idea of how tightly you crochet. So it's time to chain some stitches. For the V-stitch, you need to have an odd number of stitches. For my gauge, I need 13 stitches across for a width of 10 centimeters, and for the height, I need 7 rows for a height of 10 centimeters. But as explained before, I need to make the actual swatch bigger, so I'm starting with 17 chain stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. That's going to be the width of my swatch. I begin every row with 2 turning chain stitches, so I chain them here too. These 2 turning chain stitches never count as a double crochet. I've opted for just 2 chain stitches instead of 3 to avoid creating large holes on the edges of my work. If you crochet very tight chain stitches, you may wish to use a 3rd chain stitch, but I really wouldn't advise it. You skip these 2 turning chain stitches and in the 3rd chain from your hook, work your first double crochet. That's a treble in UK terms. If you look at the pattern, you'll see that I've included a crochet chart. In the chart, you'll see that you double crochet in the first chain, then skip 1 chain stitch, and work 2 double crochets in the next chain stitch. Make sure that you insert your hook under both loops of the chain stitch. Each stitch is made up of both of these 2 loops. Work 1 double crochet, then as the chart shows you, work another double crochet next to it in the very same stitch. For now, it just looks like you've got 2 double crochets directly next to each other, which isn't all that interesting, but we'll work our way back, and when we do, we're going to work between these 2 stitches, which opens them up into a nice lovely V shape. So tighten your yarn nicely if you've taken your hook out like me. Skip 1 chain stitch and work 2 double crochets in the next one. Then skip 1 chain and work 2 double crochets again in the next. Make sure you pull both strands through. And repeat this until the end of the row, until you have 2 chain stitches left. I now have just 2 chain stitches left from my foundation chain. At the start of the row, you had a single double crochet before you started the V-stitch, and you're going to do the same here at the end. So skip the second last chain stitch and double crochet once in the last stitch. And that's row 1 complete. You begin and end each row with 1 double crochet, and between each pair of double crochets, you work 2 more double crochets. To turn your work, first chain 2 turning chains. As I said before, they never count as a double crochet. Then in the last double crochet from the previous row, work 1 double crochet. Then we continue in V-stitch, which as before means 2 double crochets next to each other in the same stitch. But remember, you double crochet between the 2 double crochets of the previous row, instead of working through the V-loops of the stitch itself. So in the space between the 2 double crochets. So this is my first double crochet between the 2 double crochets. And then I double crochet again in the same space between the 2 double crochets. And as you can now see, these 2 double crochets have been pushed apart a little to create a V-stitch. And that's the V-stitch. You continue in the space between the next pair of double crochets. Make sure you don't work in this space above the skipped chain stitch, but between the 2 double crochets worked in the same stitch. So in there, work your 2 double crochets. Repeat this between the next pair of double crochets, and so on. So 2 double crochets between each pair of double crochets from the previous row. You end this row as you began it with a single double crochet worked into the last double crochet from the previous row. So not in the 2 turning chain stitches. Skip those and work into the top of the actual double crochet. Then chain 2 to turn your work, and from this point you carry on in the same way. You begin with 1 double crochet, work 2 double crochets between each pair of double crochets to create the V-shaped stitches, and then at the end of the row, work 1 double crochet into the top of the last double crochet, chain 2 to turn, and continue working back and forth in the same pattern. For your 10 by 10 gauge swatch, you need 7 rows, so I recommend that you crochet a total of 8 rows. That's because your first row always bunches a little bit and doesn't give you the most reliable picture of how tightly you crochet. It's always better to skip the first one and then measure the next 7 rows and see if they come out to 10 centimeters. So continue until you have 8 rows in total. This is the 8th row of my gauge swatch. So that's it done now. The added bonus of making a gauge swatch before starting a garment is that it lets you practice the stitch before you begin. Otherwise, you might find the first rows of your cardigan or sweater look quite different or less neat from the rest of the piece until you get the hang of the stitch pattern. So it's doubly important that you make a gauge swatch, not just to check your crochet tension, but also to make sure you have the stitches you need under your belt. Now let me get my measuring tape so I can measure my swatch. Let's see if my 13 stitches across come out at 10 centimeters and if 7 rows measure 10 centimeters. As you can see, the first row is a bit bunched together, so I discount that one and instead measure from row 2 to the top. As you can see, that's 10 centimeters. And now for the stitches. Let me count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And that's 10 centimeters. So my gauge swatch is spot on, 10 by 10 centimeters, 13 stitches by 7 rows. And if I use this same crochet tension to make my cardigan, I can be sure that my cardigan will turn out to be the size indicated in the pattern. If you have a lot more stitches than 10 centimeters, that means that you crochet more tightly than I do. In that case, use a larger crochet hook. Try making a swatch with a 6.5mm hook. And if that's still too many stitches, try it with a 7mm hook. If you have much fewer stitches per 10 centimeters, try a 5.5mm or 5mm hook. If you use a smaller or larger hook, that means you also need to adjust the size of the second hook called for in the pattern. If you use a half size larger hook, make sure that the second smaller hook is also a half size bigger than indicated in the pattern. But if you use a half size smaller hook, make sure that the second hook is also a half size smaller. There always needs to be a 1mm difference between the two hook sizes. That's our swatch done, so have a go yourself and see if you end up with the same gauge as I do. And then you're ready to start the cardigan, which we'll do next week. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining in. I hope you have the hang of the stitch we'll be using, and I'll see you next week when we get started on the back panel.